Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this 52nd observance of Earth Day, a celebration of our environment, water resources, and a means really to draw attention to the important environmental issues we face, especially here in South Florida. My name is Steve Davis, and I am the Everglades Foundation's Vice President for Communications and Engagement. I'm also a scientist, having researched the Everglades and South Florida's waterways for more than 25 years. Our CEO, Eric Eichenberg, unfortunately will not be joining us this morning as he was called just yesterday to an event with Governor DeSantis and the South Florida Water Management District, really to celebrate a step forward in Everglades restoration that will help to resolve some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. Impacts to our environment, water quality, and how that impacts human health. And so they're going to be there celebrating the signing of a project partnership agreement to move forward with the Everglades Reservoir with the Army Corps of Engineers. The Everglades Foundation has been around for 28 years, and since day one, our mission has been to restore and protect the Everglades, not just for its important environmental resources and biodiversity, but also because it's the water supply for 9 million Floridians. That's 42% of our population. The Everglades gives rise to South Florida's great fishing, boating, and other water-based recreational opportunities. It's tied to the health of our region's real estate values. It also supports our tourism industry, and tourism obviously being incredibly important in the state. We know that Everglades restoration will not only improve our environment and economy, will also greatly reduce the polluted, harmful discharges to our east and west coast, something that seems to be occurring nearly every year now. And over the years related to this issue, we've convened a number of groups of realtors, business owners, anglers, and even scientists to raise awareness on this issue and to educate folks how this problem is all tied to our outdated water management system. And that's something that Everglades restoration was really planned and designed to fix. Today, we're going to be joined by an impressive group of medical professionals from South Florida that will help us elucidate the connection between environmental health and human health, specifically the links between water pollution, toxic algae, and our health and everyday lives. These folks represent both our east and west coast of Florida because both coasts are experiencing the near annual impacts of polluted Lake Okeechobee discharges and the algae that we're seeing again nearly every year. And these discharges are a direct result of cutting the natural flow of water from the lake to the south, to the Everglades. And these changes began really nearly a century ago. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I'd like to set the stage for our conversation with a few slides that will tee up the problem and really the solution from an environmental health perspective. So the problems we experience related to our water management system really stem from the changes in the way water flows through South Florida. Historically, the Everglades was connected from the Kissimmee chain of lakes up here near Orlando, all the way down through Lake Okeechobee, and then all the way south over 100 miles from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And we changed that flow in really the first half of the last century to where now when water flows into Lake Okeechobee, it can't go south because of the establishment of that agricultural area. And so water doesn't flow south naturally. Instead, when water goes into Lake Okeechobee, it's discharged to the west coast, down the Caloosahatchee, to the east coast, down the St. Lucie towards the city of Stuart. And over the decades of this replumbing, Lake Okeechobee has become polluted to the point where now when those discharges are made, it's not only carrying unnatural volumes of fresh water to both coasts, it's carrying toxic algae along with it. Now, there's very little water that flows south, and much of what the Everglades gets is runoff from this agricultural area. And so we only have the naturally functioning area of the Everglades to the south near Everglades National Park. It just doesn't get the volumes of water that it once received. In fact, it gets about half the water that it received historically. So Everglades Restoration will steer this current system back towards the natural system on the left. I mentioned Lake Okeechobee is polluted. In 2018, this is a satellite interpretation of algae cover on the 700 plus square mile Lake Okeechobee. And in July of 2018, more than 90% of that lake was covered in toxic blue-green algae. This is a photo that one of our staff members, Sarah Perry Kearney, took just this past weekend at the structure that releases water to the St. Lucie. And you can see that neon green toxic blue-green algae just waiting to be discharged. We often see these advisories now along our waterways to recommending avoiding contact because of the presence of toxic blue-green algae. The discharges, when they're made to both coasts, they're in such massive quantities, it's hard to imagine. And you can see just on this day, there were a couple thousand cubic feet per second being sent to the East Coast. And on this day, there were about 3 times that volume going to the West Coast, to the Caloosahatchee. So this is a high volume of polluted water going to both coasts. This is what it looks like when it reaches the Caloosahatchee estuary near Sanibel. We see the same type of impact on the East Coast. And again, this sort of feeds the growth of algae that we know causes human health issues that we're going to be talking about with our experts. And it's not just blue-green algae, it's also red tide. And we're learning that the discharges from Lake Okeechobee, when we have red tide near shore, exacerbate this problem. And all we have to do is go back to that extended bloom that went from late 2017 into early 2019 to know how bad red tide can be, not only on our West Coast, but in this particular event, we saw it shift around along the Florida Keys over to our East Coast, and that really raised attention. Certainly, we know the impacts to marine life, to organisms within our estuaries, marine mammals and fish, but it also has human health concerns as well. Again, I mentioned Everglades Restoration, this effort to rework our water infrastructure, to build projects around South Florida that help us to store water, clean water, and redirect it to the South. And we're making great progress. Projects like the Everglades Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, now under construction, that will help us to steer massive quantities of water, clean that water back to the South, and again, reducing those harmful discharges to the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie. So joining us this morning are 3 medical experts with direct experience in admitting and treating patients that have come into contact or experienced symptoms related to these toxic water issues on both our coasts. Mr. Rob Lord is the president and CEO of the Cleveland Clinic Martin Health. He's a graduate of Stetson University College of Law, Florida State University. Lord holds board certification as healthcare executive from the American College of Healthcare Executives. The Florida Bar has also recognized him as a board certified specialist in health law. Mr. Lord is a longtime resident of Martin County. He's also an avid fisherman. Thank you for joining us this morning, Mr. Lord.
My pleasure.
We also have Dr. Carl Ruthman, who's a pulmonary and critical care physician with Naples Community Hospital Physician Group, with an impressive academic background. Dr. Ruthman moved to Florida in 2011 for his residency in pulmonary and critical care training at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. Born and raised in Peoria, Illinois, another Midwesterner here, Dr. Ruthman first traveled to Southwest Florida to visit his grandparents on Manasota Key in the 1980s. And that really is what hooked him into being an outdoor enthusiast and also an avid fisherman. He recognizes the Everglades as a globally unique treasure and views our current opportunities for better stewardship of this priceless resource as morally imperative. Dr. Ruthman, thank you also for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Mary Beth Saunders is an infectious disease specialist in Fort Myers, Florida, and is affiliated with multiple hospitals here in the area, including Cape Coral Hospital, Lee Memorial Hospital. She has received her medical degree from Kansas City University College of Osteopathic Medicine and has been in practice for more than 20 years. Dr. Saunders, also, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
This is really a great opportunity. We appreciate the three of you joining us on this special day. This is an important topic. We have limited time, so I want to dive right in. And Rob, thinking about your historical perspective in the region, you've lived along the St. Lucie since 1969, having fished out there for a number of those years. Can you just sort of set the stage, speak to some of the changes that you've observed, and really how the awareness of human health impacts around our environment has changed over that time?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, Steve, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to talk about this subject. As you indicated, my family moved here back in 1969. My father was an avid outdoorsman. I picked that up and have been fishing in the St. Lucie River and the Indian River as well here locally for my entire life virtually. And I love to wade, and the things that I've experienced in my life, I'm just incredibly grateful that the interactions I've had with wildlife, with manatees and dolphins and other things as a wader, I think is unique. Among fishermen who stay in boats, I would tell them, get out of the boat. You'd be amazed how nature will relate to you when you do that. What has changed over those years, unfortunately, is that obviously the water quality has declined. It was a long time after 1969, in the mid 1990s. My wife and our daughters and I would go up into the Indian River and find conchs. Horseshoe crabs were prevalent. I've interacted with sawfish and other things that are rare species to see, but this is one of the most diverse estuaries that you'll find anywhere on the planet. And so the things I've seen are amazing. What saddens me greatly is you don't see them anymore. Are many of those species. The horseshoe crab is an example that I find very rarely, but I understand that they're quite sensitive to some of the problems that we have. So what we've seen over time is this degradation of the St. Lucie River and the Indian River, which connects with it here. So what comes out of the St. Lucie here migrates up and down the Indian River estuary lagoon, so it causes a tremendous amount of damage. And then recently, with the algae blooms that we've had, it has evolved into a significant public health issue. And in my role as president of 3 hospitals here on the Treasure Coast, I think we have an obligation to the people who live here to address this as a public health issue. I've been addressing it many years personally because of the environmental concerns, but we've had to post messages in our emergency room asking people, have you come in contact with the water? We've seen a number of illnesses. We have people far more qualified than I am. I am not a medical doctor, but once you have to do that, then I think a healthcare system has a social obligation to step up and speak for the public on these issues. And that's what we've tried to do here at Martin Health. And ever since the merger with Cleveland Clinic, we've done the same thing.
Well, thank you for that. And Dr. Ruthman, and then I'll pass the same question to Dr. Saunders. We know that fresh water is essential for life. Our bodies are comprised mostly of water, and but there are instances now, and it's increasing, where we're seeing that contact with fresh water can be harmful, if not fatal. Can you describe the different kinds of contact and concerns that we have specifically with toxic algae?
Sure. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Robert. That was I'll echo a lot of the sentiments that you just expressed in terms of this being a personal issue for those of us who really love to be out in the ecosystem, as you put it, a public health issue, and as I think we'll touch on later, an economic issue. From the public health standpoint, in my practice as a pulmonary and critical care physician, probably the most dramatic example of these harmful algal blooms and how they affect human health is with the red tides that you referenced earlier. And that picture you showed of the dead snook and redfish, is again, touches on both of these points of this being toxic to health, in that case fish, and also to the recreational opportunities. But specific to red tide, this is an algae called Karenia brevis that produces these things called brevetoxins, which interact with humans through something called a voltage gated sodium channel. And without getting too into the weeds with the toxicology of it, basically this can affect humans in a couple of ways. Number one, and the thing that most of us will recognize when one of these blooms happen, is that it's an irritant to our eyes, the mucosal surfaces of our nose and mouth, and our airways. And people have a varying degrees of sensitivity to this. And it can be problematic and bothersome to anyone, even people with perfectly normal, healthy lungs. But for my patients, the folks with chronic lung disease, and it's not specific to one type of chronic lung disease, any person who has diminished lung capacity, who gets their airways irritated and finds themselves in a coughing fit, can get into really big trouble. And dramatic examples of that would be asthmatic patients who go into respiratory failure. And so it's not hyperbole to talk about this as a matter of life and death for patients with, for example, severe asthma or any variety of chronic lung diseases. The cyanobacteria, I think I should probably leave some room for Dr. Saunders to talk a little bit more about those and just the really wide variety of toxins that can be produced by this fairly diverse group of microorganisms. But in my capacity as a critical care physician, we have to be sensitive to all of these species as well, because there's a variety of different illnesses that can be caused, usually through ingestion of either shellfish or reef fish, or just direct interaction with the water, more usually the freshwater environments. But as you're aware, the fresh and salt water, there's a whole brackish shade of gray in between, and so we can find these different toxins in waters all the way from the Caloosahatchee into the estuarine areas and in the Gulf of Mexico as well too.
Dr. Saunders, you're really in ground central in the Lee County, Fort Myers area, and so you're right at that nexus of both red tide and these toxic blue-green algae blooms. Could you sort of expound on that and what Dr. Ruthman just mentioned?
Sure. So, I have to say this weekend I was paddleboarding off of the A-span going to Sanibel, and there was just beautiful teal blue water, water that I'd never seen in the over 20 years that I've lived here. It's always been kind of dark and can't really see so well. So just, seeing that change in water, knowing that they've decreased the amount of releases from Lake O makes a huge difference. And, we can have that beautiful blue coastline that we see elsewhere when that restoration does occur. So I do appreciate, the foundation's efforts, the governor's efforts, and really trying to get Florida back to where it had been so many years ago. But yes, we are unique in our area. As you know, Cape Coral, just numerous canals and areas there where you have fresh water. And then again, we experienced significant red tide in 2018 and 19 off of our Captiva, Sanibel Coast, and all along our southern coast here. And you know, the patients will present with very similar symptoms. It's one of those kind of unique things that we do see in our area and we're used to. But when those events occur, we have to flex up as a health system. And that's where Lee Health really collaborates with the Florida Department of Health. They're so great in their exchanges with us. And at those times, just like when we have anything else, just like when we're experiencing COVID, we have to change what we do and how we understand that patient population coming in. So as spoke to before, when these events do occur, we kind of up our game of the questions that we ask patients coming in and really direct those questions related to red tide, blue-green algae, and then provide that information for the Florida Department of Health so they can continue their monitoring. But those symptoms often are very similar to what you may experience when you have a mild viral infection. So the kind of itchy eyes or irritated eyes, runny nose, having a little slight dry cough, and just feeling a little bit of that burning in your lungs or not feeling well. And then we really have to dive into more questions. You know, do you have risk for being exposed to blue-green algae or red toxin based on what their occupation is, if they work on the water, or, you know, if they live in those areas. And certainly during the heavy times and during the seasonal periods when we do have this, we see a lot more folks presenting with those symptoms. Generally, the symptoms will improve when they're out of the environment, but obviously if you live there, you cannot get out of your environment very easily. Or if you're working in those areas and you know you have an 8 or 12-hour shift, you have that exposure during that period of time. So we do rely on our local internists, family practice doctors, and our pulmonary critical care, you know, to help those folks during that period of time. And certainly if you have underlying lung disease, asthma, or COPD, you may experience more severe and persistent respiratory symptoms. The other concern of Floridians, Southern Floridians, is their pets. Everyone has their pets out and about and on the beaches and, you know, just enjoying our areas of Florida. And, you know, they can be affected as well. And then, of course, we've all seen the effects on the wildlife and the fish and manatee populations in our area.
Yeah, and, you know, you mentioning pets and Rob mentioning some of the environmental change that he's seen over time. I mean, we're seeing sort of degrees of sensitivity and response to these changes over time where, you know, the conch and some of the things that Rob has observed, you know, they may have disappeared long ago. Pets obviously extremely sensitive and certainly concerns about our own health that we need to recognize. And you mentioned the communication that you have with Department of Health, Dr. Saunders. Rob, your hospital was known for, you know, instituting as part of the patient admission process a question: have you come into contact with the water? And how has that sort of changed the way your hospitals, you know, admit patients, treat patients, and then also communicate with the state, you know, on these environmental health problems?
We obviously all healthcare providers should be reporting this information, you know, in accordance with regulatory requirements. We were in a bit of a unique situation, at least for us. You know, we didn't have a lot to go on when this first started happening. But we, you know, the physicians in the emergency department and in private practice started to come in contact with people with the symptoms that Dr. Saunders described. You know, respiratory issues, rashes, irritation of the eyes and throat and what have you. And we realized that it was becoming was a likely cause of people presenting to our emergency room. those patients that Dr. Ruthman was referencing, his patients, those people that have pulmonary conditions or that were particularly susceptible to this. And so I think we were the first to literally post signs in the emergency room, similar to what we did with Ebola, trying to make sure that patients knew to let us know if they had been in contact with the water, if they'd been out on it, or if they lived on it, or lived near it. You don't have to be right on the water. You don't have to come in contact with it to suffer some of this irritation. So we continue to focus on it. Now back in when we first started dealing with this, we were a community healthcare system located just on the Treasure Coast. And as I was fond of saying back then, it wasn't our job to conduct scientific research. Our job is to treat the patients, get them better, and get them home. That's now with the Cleveland Clinic as a research-based organization that focuses on research and education. We can take a little different approach and be more active in participating in the research into this. I'm very excited to see us do that. As we move forward with it and as we try to advise our patients on what you do, as again, as Dr. Saunders noted, if you live on it, it's hard to, there's not a lot you can do other than stay inside. And that's defeating the purpose of living on or near the river. So, that's a problem. And for me, as I sit and look at this problem, the one of the issues that we've confronted over time is the concerns that we're still researching this. There's a lot of things that we can't present conclusive scientific evidence about what the downstream effects are of these conditions. One thing I'm fond of saying is I have a high confidence level that we're not going to find out that blue-green algae is good for us 20 years from now. It's a question of how bad it is the outcome. What are the significant impacts of 20, 30 years of exposure to this? The analogy I use is cigarette smoking. First cigarette you smoke doesn't kill you. But the more exposure you have, the more risk you have. And I'm concerned that that's the situation we're into. So we're trying to take a look at it from that standpoint and to be good stewards of these incredible resources that have been entrusted to us in our community. Our health system is trying to play a constructive part in addressing that while at the same time meeting the day-to-day needs of the patients we serve.
Well, thank you for that. And that really tees up, kind of that question of, these acute symptoms that Doctors Ruthman and Saunders described versus the more chronic issues related to either red tide or blue-green algae. And I think it's important to note that these blue-green algae issues and cyanotoxins are not unique to Lake Okeechobee. We see these problems in the Great Lakes, and we're increasingly seeing them in water bodies in temperate regions where warming also seems to be playing a role in increasing the preponderance in polluted waterways, these blue-green algae. So, Dr. Ruthman, and then I'll certainly pass to Dr. Saunders, but can you talk, what do we know about some of the chronic exposure problems with these toxins?
Thank you. What I'll say to concisely answer that question and to echo what Mr. Lord said is not enough. So there are some fairly clearly established cause and effect links between, obviously we just mentioned, I talked about red tide at some length because it's of particularly interest to me, but amongst the very broad categories of cyanobacteria and other harmful, flagellate and eukaryotic species that can live in the Gulf or in our estuarine areas. To name a few, we have things like neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, paralytic shellfish poisoning, diuretic shellfish poisoning. There's a theme here of eating shellfish in terms of how these toxins tend to accumulate in bivalves. But ciguatera is another example of something that we can get just from eating reef fish, for example, or amnestic shellfish poisoning, which is not exclusive to shellfish. So I like the metaphor of the tip of the iceberg. When we talk about what is known and these well-established links, which are more acute syndromes, relative to, as Robert said, what all of us who do this have a fairly high degree of confidence is that probably long-term chronic low-level exposure, I don't mean to do too much speculation, but we know these things are toxic in high acute doses. And so if we use a little bit of common sense, it's probably not good to be exposed to them at lower levels along longer periods of time. That being said, those links are less well established scientifically at this point.
Dr. Saunders?
I think he's right. It's going to take more time and research, and it's not accelerated like it has been with COVID. We don't know what is the tipping point for some people in their autoimmune system and the things that happen. So how much or what is it that may tip one person's autoimmune system to develop a certain disease or syndrome that another person does not? But along the way, there's been these casual associations. It's been very hard to pinpoint a concrete association. But I think, continuing the vigilance of saying this, we know it is a problem, and they've seen it in the manatee studies and other, finfish studies, that it is a problem. And so we need to do everything that we can to make sure our waterways are safe, and just can't take our eyes off of that ball. When we have an event, it's to the forefront of everyone's mind, and everyone says, we need to do something now, we want to do it. But it's just like your program and you keeping everyone focused on that, even during times when we may have low levels, and it's not as predominant in our community, but staying the course.
Stephen, if I could just jump back in very quickly.
Sure.
To be clear on what my concern is here, I've had it suggested to me many times that this needs more study. Before we do anything, it needs more study. And that's the point that I'm trying to get to there is, let's not wait 20 years for us to find out what the result. We do need to study it. Not my suggestion. This needs to be a strong focus of research. But let's not wait 20 years to have that happen. We have a history of doing that in this country. And I referenced cigarette smoking before. I'm older than I think everybody on this call. I'm well into my 60s. I remember a time when there was debate about whether or not cigarette smoking was bad for you. But the scientific community was very much aligned on that. But it was not until the mid 1960s that the federal government finally came out and said, okay, there's conclusive proof. But by that time, tens of thousands of people had died. Let's not do that thing here. Again, to what Dr. Ruthman said, let's apply a little common sense here. We know these things are toxic. I can't imagine that long-term exposure will have any positive benefits. And it's difficult for me to fathom that we're not going to ultimately determine that there are not negative consequences to human health, not to mention the health of the creatures that live in that estuary.
Well, I think one of the takeaways here is that there's so much that we don't know. And I can say from the water quality perspective, there's so much that we're not even measuring. I've got a colleague at Florida International University that understands blue-green algae and some of the toxins they produce. And I shouldn't say some, the toxins they produce are incredibly diverse. We're talking hundreds of different toxins that one species can produce and release into the water. And we might only be measuring a few of those when we measure, quote unquote, the toxicity of the water. And they all are bioreactive in some way. So it's really understanding more about what these organisms are producing, even before we understand how it's affecting us and our long-term health. So that's really valuable to hear from all of you. Thank you. And one of the things that we've been hearing, and we know that some of these toxins are more impactful to the liver. They're hepatotoxins. We've heard that some of them are neurotoxins. Do any of you have any experience or understanding of that? There's certainly concern as our population ages and we start to see more of a prevalence of neurodegenerative diseases. Is there any evidence to suggest that?
I can speak a little bit to that. So yeah, I'm glad you're emphasizing the point of that this is not a simple problem from a microbiologic standpoint. It's almost overwhelming when you start to wade into this and look at the variety of species, hundreds of species. I think it's probably safe to say when we talk about cyanobacteria and all of the dinoflagellates and all of these other things that can produce this variety of toxins. Absolutely. And the other thing that I've been struck by as I've been learning more about this is that even attributing specific toxins to specific species is still a little bit tricky. And this could have to do with differential gene expression, depending on how many nutrients are available, what the weather patterns are like. There's some suggestion that some of these toxins may be what's called encoded in plasmid DNAs, so that they can actually share their toxins with each other. So that's right. It's extraordinarily complex, and really just about any organ system can be affected. You mentioned hepatotoxicity, neurotoxicity, direct problems with skin, and the majority of these links are with either direct exposure to the water or ingestion of water or species that have sort of accumulated these toxins in their flesh. That's the well-established route of ingestion for humans, at least.
So do these problems, in thinking about this from your perspective, admitting patients, treating patients, do you see that these problems go away when the water clears up? Are there sort of lingering effects or a lagged response in the patients that you work with? And this is really for the three of you.
Yeah, I'll field that briefly and pass it on. I'll say yes and no. I think when we talk about red tide specifically, that is really a problem now when the bloom is happening, right? Because the predominant problems that causes is from aerosolized toxin from the water being churned up either from boats or the surf, et cetera. And when the algal bloom calms down, the problem is not there anymore. In the case of these cyanotoxins, and when I use that term, that's a broad term that applies to these chemically distinct things. So it's a big variety of toxins that can hurt different parts of your body. They can stick around in shellfish for years, right? These compounds, particularly the brevetoxins and sigarotoxin, for example, are very stable in nature. So even putting fish in the microwave or boiling it, or exposing it to acid, like we might do if we're making ceviche on the boat, kind of thing, does not kill this toxin. So these things are stable, which is not a good thing, meaning they can stick around in nature for a long, long time.
Yeah. Rob or Dr. Saunders?
Just something I observed over here. We've had a couple of times where the blue-green algae formed a cake on top of the water. And there's a marina near my house where that was a significant problem. And as I watched that problem evolved as it was winding down, those cakes of this algae sank to the bottom. And generally, if you get into those marinas where you don't have good throughput on the water, they tend to form a silt bottom. If you happen to get off and wade in there and you could touch the bottom, you likely would sink to your knees in a silt. But the thought occurred to me, okay, these toxins now become a part of that silt. And again, without good water flowing through and stuff, the silt just stays there. Again, I get back to this, what are the long-term effects of that? I will tell you, I grew up eating snook and trout and redfish out of the St. Lucie River and the Indian River, and I don't eat it anymore. I rarely wade, or when I do, I generally wear waders, and I used to wear an old pair of tennis shoes and a pair of shorts. It's those things that you look at. What is on the bottom of our rivers and our estuaries. I'm familiar a little bit with the Caloosahatchee, and a beautiful part of our state. I love it, but I suspect they've had some of the some similar issues over there because of coves and whatever. You don't know what you're hiding on the bottom of your river and what the long-term impact of that is going to be, and what it would ever take to get rid of it. Because that, cleansing that system it will be a tremendous challenge if it's needed.
I think we don't really know, the long-term neurologic effects of what some of these toxins may cause get lost over time. Someone may present acutely. We say, yes, could this be related to red tide or blue-green algae? And then as they're followed by the neurologist over time, that becomes a distant memory. They continue on with a chronic syndrome, and how that association and those chronic long-term problems, we kind of forget where they may have originated from. So until there is a distinct disease that we can say, hey, this is neurologic associated red-green chronic problem from red algae or red tide, then it's hard to make that association. But I think we all are of the same feeling. We know that there's probably chronic problems. It's just giving it that label, and the way it is right now, we kind of lose that label over time.
Rob described the caking of the blue-green algae in some of those marinas, and we visited some of those in 2016. It's several inches thick. We even heard it described as guacamole, and it accumulated so much so in those areas that the businesses had to shut down. And it's important to note that that's a freshwater algae that was proliferating in an estuary that's supposed to have some mix of fresh and salt water. So it really speaks to that video I showed earlier. The magnitude of those discharges from Lake Okeechobee is such that it takes these estuaries and turns them into not just a freshwater body, but a polluted freshwater body that supports the growth of this freshwater blue-green algae. And so those, again, it speaks to the volume of those discharges and the level of pollution, something that we can control, something we caused and something we can control in part with Everglades Restoration, but we also know there's a lot more that we need to do in terms of cleaning up our waterways. But I think, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I would just like to get each of your perspectives, and you all spend time on the water. And you've all experienced these types of events. Can you each just give a little bit of perspective of what you see as just a recreational water enthusiast in terms of how it's affected, whether it's business, fishing, tourism, just from your own perspective? I think it would be very helpful.
I'll start out. When my family moved to Stuart in 1969. We are the self-proclaimed sailfish capital of the world. I believe the largest snook in North America can be caught right here in Stuart, Florida, or between Fort Pierce and here. And I've caught a couple of them, 40 pounds or so. But we don't see that as much anymore. We've seen, it's had an adverse impact on tourism. It's had an adverse impact from time to time on businesses, as you alluded to. When we run into significant problems, you have to stay away from the river. The economic impact of this is not insignificant. It is interesting to me from time to time, though, in our community, in the business community. In fact, I've been subject to some criticism by folks who feel like by us taking an active role in this, we've had a negative impact on tourism. I think that's very nearsighted. I think we have, this problem is not a secret. When these massive blooms have occurred, whether it's red tide or the blue-green algae, it has been a national news story. And when it makes that, makes that news, people decide to not come to the southwest coast of Florida on their vacation. They'll go someplace else. Or here we know tourism is one of the principal drivers of the economy here in Florida. And then on a personal level, I've already hit on it. I don't. There's so many things that I don't do. I wish I spent more time in the water with my two grandsons. But they're young. I don't want to expose them to that, and so those concerns keep me from doing that. It's dramatically modified how I behave and interact with the waterways, and that's true of so many people in our area. We don't get in the water like we used to.
So I just want to talk a little bit about perspective of how to think about it from other diseases that we know of in humans, and maybe what's happening with our water. So now our waters are contaminated with these algae, and there are certain times when those algae are going to be more prolific, and other times where they may be more quiescent. It's the same thing if someone their body becomes colonized with a bacteria called C. difficile that can cause diarrhea. And when we influence the normal bacteria in someone's bowel that keeps that bacteria suppressed by giving them antibiotics and decreasing that bacteria, then we can see that bacteria just grow very ferociously and cause illness. So in some respects, it's no different than our waterways. When we change the natural biome of those water areas and kill off some of the natural things that should be occurring, and then allow these algae to grow prolifically, we see the consequences of that. But I have children who are born and raised in Florida, avid fishing children, probably fish way more than they should. And, just how sad it was a few years ago when the fish populations had decreased dramatically and they would go out fishing for hours at a time and, catch just very few fish. And now I every time they're out, I get pictures of my kids with, just big, beautiful snook that are just gorgeous. And they have, had a great day catching a lot of fish. And so they are enjoying, the new revigoration of our fish population now.
Dr. Ruthman?
Yeah, well, Dr. Saunders, I'll start by offering your kids a second opinion that there's no such thing as too much fishing. So
I second that.
Yeah. I think I might maybe don't get enough in, so they can balance me out. I'll just tell a couple of personal anecdotes more as a citizen and as an avid outdoorsman. Just going back to the last real horrendous red tide bloom we had of digging trenches at my parents' house. They live on Lemon Bay up in Sarasota County, and burying all these beautiful redfish and snook and such a variety of species that were washing ashore in droves. And it's something I'll remember for the rest of my life for how absolutely heartbreaking it was. And during that entire year, a friend of mine, a fishing buddy named David Zim, who's really just an all-around good guy, but has asthma and didn't fish for a year. And if you think about how much your kids love fishing, how much those of us love being out on the water, to be, the emotional toll of that, of missing out on those things, that's also a human toll with this. So it's a big iceberg, and we can only see the tip of it, I think.
Wow. Well, thank you all. I want to open this up to some audience Q&A. We have 10 minutes remaining, and we have a few questions that have been entered into the Q&A. And if others have questions, please take advantage of that. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Ellie Decker, she mentioned that she's attended a forum recently, and she kind of, getting to what Dr. Saunders mentioned earlier about how these kinds of things reflect an imbalance in the environment and how they can take advantage of perhaps an imbalance in our own system. And so she's asking, is there any evidence that these types of exposures can influence our immune system, where they could, not take advantage of a compromised immune system, but perhaps influence our immune system moving forward?
Sure. So anytime that we are suffering from chronic exposure or chronic illness, it does take a toll on our immune system. And over time depletes our body's ability to respond to other infections and things. So we see that with other disease states. We know that kind of chronic trial onto your own system can cause that. So again, one of those things probably where we don't have proof, but just seeing it day to day in our patients and knowing, and even as Dr. Ruthman said, that emotional toll affecting people's ability to recover from illness, and then just, developing depression and other chronic illnesses that are related to that.
Yeah, I'll echo Dr. Saunders to a certain degree. When we talk about immune activity, and I'll focus a little bit on the lungs and the airways. First, you have to start from the understanding that our immune system has a tremendously challenging job, which it's really amazing that it ever gets it right. But we know from a lot of other conditions that when there's chronic low-level inflammation or irritation of tissues, that can cause a variety of problems in terms of overactivation of the immune system. And so in the case, again, of red tide, what we see is it directly stimulates the release of histamine in the airways, which creates a whole cascade of inappropriate activity in the immune system. So that's one where there is a fairly well delineated link between what we call histaminergic type inflammation and the symptoms that we see. So yeah, those links are, I call it hypothetical science in terms of we know that brevetoxin, for example, stimulates histamine release. And then what we know about chronic inflammation, we can then extrapolate to say this is not a good idea for really anyone, and particularly those with chronic lung disease, to be exposed to this for over periods of time.
And unfortunately, antihistamines don't really seem to help so much. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Ruthman? It's just the patients don't get the symptomatic relief that they would from when they have pollen exposure, et cetera.
I agree with that. And what we're forced to use is kind of more powerful agents like systemic steroids, which of course carry their own side effects and things like that. So that's exactly right. There's no good direct antidotes for any of these. That's something that's worth mentioning as well, too.
We have a question here that, is there any sort of interaction between the healthcare industry on either coast and groups like Moat Marine that is studying red tide? There was mention of the Department of Health. I think it'd be helpful for folks to just understand the connections. That these aren't hospitals that are operating within a vacuum. There's obviously networking and communications that go on well beyond the confines of those buildings. So if each of you could kind of speak to how you network with different groups to understand what's going on.
Sure. Well, early on, when we did have our event a few years ago, we did work with Martin Health and shared information with them and actually exchanged ideas on how we could, best alert our patients, work with the Florida Department of Health. We had some panel discussions with the Naples Community Hospital and Naples Regional Hospital. And so just Lee Health taking a very active role in trying to keep the community information out there, creating a web page for people who live here to be able to access and get up-to-date information on blue-green algae if they were used to going to Lee Health websites. And then of course, the Florida Department of Health always has a lot of information that and the maps that they kept in real time for people to see regarding the activity of red tide and blue-green algae.
Yes, and I would just throw in there that first of all, I have tremendous respect and admiration for the Lee Health system. It's a remarkable system. I know that for years here at Martin Health, we've greatly valued the relationship we've had with that organization. And now with Cleveland Clinic, we're deepening that relationship with Lee Health, and hopefully we can extend it into this area. What I have seen is over the last several years, I think there's better coordination, better communication. That may be influenced in part by the fact by joining the clinic. As I indicated earlier, there's a focus on research. It's one of the pillars of our organization and what we stand for. And there has been research going on in Northeast Ohio at the main campus for many years because of some of the problems on the Great Lakes, or at least that's what started it. But I'm, what I would say is if I went back to 2016, if you over the last 5 years, I think that if the events over the last 5-6 years that we've dealt with on both coasts have increased the level of involvement of the local healthcare systems and has caused a greater nexus with our state's wonderful educational organizations, institutions, and better cooperation and coordination with scientists. So I'm seeing that improve. I believe there's still room for further improvement, and we should not lose sight of that. This is one of those situations where what we've done is good, but we can't let being good be the enemy of becoming great.
I'll agree with what the other panelists said, and add one point that the fact that you're asking this question, I think, points to a really important aspect to how we come up with solutions, which is that this can't be just addressed in Collier County. We can't fix it just here. They can't fix it just in Lee County. As Steve, you already pointed out, this ecosystem extends from north of Orlando down to the Keys. And so it really will require a regional approach. I have to give the Everglades Foundation, obviously, some credit here for putting this webinar together. I'll give our NCH administration credit for being so involved with the Everglades Foundation. Another organization I'm part of called Captains for Clean Water, I think, is another group that takes a regional approach to helping to solve some of these problems. And these coordinated efforts is what it's going to take.
Well, thank you. We have just a couple minutes remaining, and there's a question here about, again, thinking about this from a community perspective, and you all are certainly, integrated into your communities. You understand the value of our natural resources and the connection there with our economy. Are you seeing the attention to this locally, at state level, at the national level? And would you have any recommendations moving forward?
I do think, at Lee Health, we have a liaison with our, state government, and they keep us abreast of what the governor is doing, but certainly a lot of work, he's put a lot of work into water restoration. And, we're just all grateful that we do have such an advocate in our state who is trying to get us back to the beautiful waterways that were in the past, that were safe and clean. And so certainly I appreciate the governor and all the work of the people at the state capitol who are that yeoman's load of that.
You know what again, a shift that seems to be occurring in prior years or years ago. We would have significant discharges from Lake Okeechobee, and people would have a heightened sense of awareness and a lot of conversation, a lot of attention to the subject. And then when that resolved itself or became less significant, people tended to move on to other things. I think now with the events we've had over the last few years, it stays pretty much top of mind. People, I see greater involvement that doesn't subside when as right now. I was out on my dock last night. It was clear. I could see the bottom. I could see fish. It's really easy at that point to go, well, the problem's over. We know now that's not the case. It's the summer rains are coming, and we're just approaching the time of year where we have to have where these types of events occur. But it's a real focus, I think, of a lot of people in our community. I think it's maybe the most important political issue now, locally, and I think it's a great thing.
Dr. Ruthman?
Yeah, again, to speak to the fact that this is a political issue, what I've noticed in recent years is the public discourse has changed a little bit. Whereas I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was a lot more controversy in the public discussion about whether this represented sort of the natural ebb and flow of geologic time, and that, you know, our history isn't as long as geologic history, versus the really clear, convincing evidence that human activity, specifically rerouting the water flows, is what's causing this, or at least really intensifying it to the point that we're seeing effects on economies, human health, et cetera. So I thank institutions like the Everglades Foundation and the messaging campaign, because when you carefully examine why folks oppose Everglades restoration, it becomes clear what the incentives are. And I think that the public messaging has been successful, and that's encouraging to see. So, and then seeing this concrete action that comes as a result, and is heartening.
And Dr. Davis, we appreciate your 10 years of work and trying to help us with this campaign. So thank you.
Well, we thank you, and we're so grateful that the three of you took time out of your busy day on this special day to talk with us about this topic and help us educate folks about this connection between our environment, our economy, and our livelihoods. So thank you, and happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day to you. Thank you so much.
Happy Earth Day, everyone.